Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second episode of the Banned Book Club series where we read like freedom depends on it. This month, I am very, very pleased to come back and discuss with everybody To Kill a Mockingbird. So before we start, I'm going to just kind of give a layout of how this normally goes, or I guess how it went last time. So I'm going to be talking about themes within the book, discuss why it was challenged, and my personal views on the topics, if this book should be censored or challenged in schools. I think you guys will probably have some idea if you're familiar with the work I've done and with my perspectives in general. Usually I'll say no. However, I will say that this book definitely brings up some different parts of that discussion. I will be doing an activity as usual while I discuss these books. It's not to take away from the heaviness of the themes that we're discussing. It is more just to keep my hands busy and provide a little bit of a visual, something calming while we discuss really, really heavy things like segregation, racism, sexual assault. For this video, I'm going to be making bouquets. So I was really, really lucky that Richmond Flowers, the local flower shop just outside Richmond Station in the UK, was able to provide me with these beautiful, beautiful bouquets. And while we discuss this, I will be arranging them. I have some beautiful pink ones, yellow, some baby brush, some eucalyptus, and a couple pink roses as well to kind of add a pop of color to the mix. So To Kill a Mockingbird was written in 1960 by Harper Lee. It takes place in the South, specifically in Alabama, during the Jim Crow era. So Jim Crow specifically describes a period of time after the Civil War, which was in the mid-19th century. And during that time, there was lots and lots of segregation. I mean, the Jim Crow system specifically upheld segregation. I kind of consider it like a caste system. And when I was doing some research for this video, that is exactly how it was described as well. It was a caste system that upheld racial inequity. There were lots and lots of different aspects to this. So segregation in the way that we typically think of it in terms of in schools, the water fountains, the buses, but it even goes so far as a Black man cannot shake a white person's hand. A Black man cannot offer to light a cigarette of a white woman, considering that to be an intimate experience. This mindset, those are just a few examples, but this mindset was specifically upheld by academics in theology, in just lots and lots of, oh, I need a scissor, excuse me. As I was saying, the Jim Crow caste system specifically upheld racial inequalities, not just in the way that we typically think of it, but academics prioritized this type of rhetoric, this type of thinking. Theologists as well upheld this religious idea that people of color, specifically Black people, were inferior to white people, and because of that, they should be separate in some ways, which sounds really ridiculous. I think it was ridiculous to a lot of people at the time, definitely is now with the context we have. It was a way to promote equity. You know, we keep people in different groups, we keep people separated, and in turn, that was supposed to create a peaceful society. However, we definitely know that that wasn't the case, and that is demonstrated throughout the book To Kill a Mockingbird. So, as I said, To Kill a Mockingbird was written in 1960 by Harper Lee towards the end of the Jim Crow segregation period, and they discuss lots and lots of themes related to that, specifically through the lens of a child. Kill a Mockingbird is told through Scout's perspective. Scout is a young girl, and a young white girl, I should say, raised in a middle-class family in the segregated South, and she has an older brother named Jem, not that much older. They're both still children for the majority of this novel, if not for the, actually, I say majority, for the entire novel, they're children. However, they, you know, through their father, Atticus, who is a defense attorney, they start to witness exactly what segregation is. So this is sort of portrayed through the criminal justice system, through the social class system, through their maid, who takes on, I say maid, but you know, she really has a very maternal figure in the book. Scout and Jem's mother died when they were quite young, and so therefore Calpurnia is her name. She took on that maternal role in the house, which at the time, women typically were involved in the home, in the kitchen, in the church, not involved in the manly things like politics. That clearly is challenged throughout the book because she is critical in opening the eyes of Scout and Jem to racial inequity, and we'll get to that in a little bit. A couple things to touch on regarding this. So before anyone says anything else, I'd like to point out that even though it's told through the children's perspective, the children are racist. I think people can be we know a lot about internalized racism now, that people can be racist without intending to be racist, especially if you grow up in a society that promotes that type of racism, that type of inequity. During that time period, most people didn't see it as a problem. As I said, they saw it as a normal part of life, a way of life. And they felt like these separate groups were actually helpful to society, for actually both groups of society. So Scout and Jem, I think it starts out, I could be wrong, but I think it starts out with Scout going into the first grade, going into class, and you witness through her eyes the different levels of poverty actually that exist in the system of the white kids that are in the school. So there's the kids that don't have shoes. There's the kids that don't pass the first grade. They just keep returning and returning to that grade. There's the kids that don't have money for lunch. Scout actually tries to raise this to the teacher at the beginning of the book. They are not super receptive to it. I think it's a lot for the teacher to understand in that moment. But it starts out painting that picture of the different social and economic class systems that exist within the white community of the city that they live in. However, very quickly into the story, they start to unpack racism through the trial of Tom Robinson. So Tom Robinson is an African-American man who was accused of rape by Mayella Ewell. Bob Ewell is more of a central character to the plot. Mayella is more of a vehicle to discuss these inequities. And this is actually really based in real events. We can get into that later with the Scottsboro Boys, with Emmett Till. Those are the first examples that come to my mind of white women accusing Black men of sexual assault, rape, and the criminal justice system completely running with it, despite the amount of evidence that speaks to the opposite. I'm not going to give any spoilers to the book. I think most people who have gone to school in the US, they read the book in schools. They should know or have an understanding of the plot itself. If you don't, I'm not here to spoil it for you. I'm also not here to tell you what's right or wrong in terms of how you engage with it. I'm just here to bring up the discussions about why it was challenged, the themes of the book, and give a brief overview of the topic. So let's now jump into why this book was challenged, okay? So this book, I find it very interesting because it was challenged by both sides of the spectrum. By the right initially in the mid-80s, early 90s, and then now adamantly by the left to have this removed from schools and curriculum. And this is based on a couple major principles. All the way back to 1966, this book was challenged in Virginia. 1984, it was challenged in Alabama. 2001, it was challenged in Mississippi. At 2017, it was challenged in Minnesota. 2017, Mississippi again. 2018, California. And in 2020, in my own home state of Washington. So this was challenged by conservatives on the idea that they use really obscene and racist language. That's something that's brought up on both sides of the spectrum. The rape accusations, there were comments and thoughts that this was a little bit heavy for young people to be reading about. The immoral content as well was challenged, that this book did not represent good sides of people. It did not represent how we want people to act. And for all of those reasons, it was inappropriate for young readers. I kind of want to ask with that, was the issue racism or was the issue uncomfortable topics? I mean, I think I can formulate my own opinions, but I'd like for everybody else to do the same with theirs. In the 2010s to 2020, it was also challenged for inappropriate language by the left for the use of the N-word. I'd like to provide some of my own context with that as well. Going to school, a lot of people insisted on using the N-word while reading these books, and they felt like it portrayed, a more historically accurate lens. I don't agree with that. I never agreed with that at the time. I refrained from participating in that actually at the time, as I think most people should have. I can't say most people did, and I can't even say that all of the educators and the teachers at the time encouraged that. However, that was part of the issue, and that's also part of why it was challenged. The emotional harm to students as well. Reading these books, especially if you are an African American or you a person of color that has experienced discrimination, these can be really, really heavy themes to tackle, especially in a classroom. There might not always feel like there's the correct support mechanisms in place for students that are experiencing trauma or reliving trauma associated with these themes. This book has also been criticized a lot for the white savior complex. So that's something actually I will touch on a little bit more, my own personal thoughts on that. I think that the movie versus the book portray this aspect of things very, very differently, but we will get into that in a little bit. And for all of those reasons, concerns were raised. This book was challenged to be removed in schools. So I think that raises the other question, actually. We were talking about earlier on the right, was it racism that was uncomfortable, or was it the themes that were uncomfortable for people to sit with? I think on this side of it, it's more, is teaching racism historically accurate, and is the language necessary? I mean, I'm going to say no. I'd like to also point out that that word wasn't okay then. That word definitely isn't okay now. I don't think that needs to be touched on more through this type of discussion. I think if you're somebody who doesn't understand the harm of that word, this video is really not going to teach you anything. It's not going to change your perspective on that, because if your perspective is that that word does not bring harm, there's no convincing you otherwise. And I don't want to say I wish you well. I wish you learn. I guess I should put it more that way. Now we're going to jump into the most cited problems within the book. In the 1960s, this book was too controversial for the time. In the 1980s, the topics were inappropriate. In the 2020s, 2010s, it was harmful and outdated, didn't need to be in schools anymore. I would think that this is more indicative of the fact that our culture has changed and our culture is continuing to change, rather than the book. The book has stayed the same. And I think that also brings the question, does this book represent the racism in these areas in a non-harmful way? Or are there potentially better books that we could pick to discuss these themes that do not have a prolific use of the N-word, for example? As I said, the N-word is used throughout, won't touch much on that. So one of the major critiques is the portrayal of Black characters within the book. So this applies to Calpurnia, and this applies to Tom Robinson. I can agree with one side of that, and I might disagree more with the other side of that. Tom Robinson, I agree. I think he is a very underdeveloped character, and I think his character exists to portray the white characters learning, the white families learning. I think Calpurnia, you could argue, is the same. However, I think that her existence, her engagement in the book, the way that she speaks, protects these kids. She takes them to the First Purpose Church, a Black church in Alabama, where Scout and Jem start to question, why are there no books? Why are they not reading hymns out of books? To which Calpurnia responds, the character that they can't read. The Black people in the community were never taught to read. She taught herself to read. She taught her son to read, but that is not the reality that a lot of people were able to live with, that a lot of people were able to have access to. And I think that having these discussions is crucial to them beginning to understand the racial inequity that was happening at this time. Tom Robinson's character, on the other hand, I think really is used to frame Atticus's character. So Atticus is the father. He is the defense attorney for Tom Robinson. And Tom Robinson's character is very, very limited outside of when Atticus is in the story. Tom Robinson's character, they go to trial. Mayella takes the stand. It's very, very clear and very, very apparent early on that she, is lying. And I guess I said I wasn't going to spoil it, but I will add that a large part of this is that she claims she was assaulted and beat by a left-handed man. Her father is left-handed. Tim Robinson's left arm is damaged. He's disabled from his left arm from a cotton mill accident when he was a child. So he can't use it at all, instantly demonstrating that he could not have been the one to do it. However, the jury still finds him completely guilty, unanimously guilty. That's something that's very, very hard for Jem to accept. It's something hard for Scout, but Jem specifically is portrayed as having a very, very difficult time understanding that. And in that progression, in that journey, he starts to question the racial system and the criminal justice system. So why do we have juries? Atticus, you should just go and change the laws. Atticus, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And he really begins to question it. Tom Robinson, later on in the book, something happens to him, while at the same time that doesn't necessarily frame Tom Robinson in any type of light. I think it also shows that the plot moves forward through Tom Robinson, and that's to the extent his character is developed. So the criminal justice conversations begin and end with Tom Robinson's story. Calpurnia's involvement in the story stays consistent throughout. So that's where I will agree and disagree with that point. Another scene that really stood out to me that I think is very, very important to mention is the mob scene. So this connects to Tom Robinson as well. Atticus is at the jailhouse, and a mob shows up intent to lynch Tom Robinson for raping a white woman. And the only people there that are able to save Tom Robinson are the children, who begin to talk to the mob. Scout connects with one of the men in the mob, who is the father of one of her classmates, speaks about how kind the child is. She's sorry for the difficulty in his life. And lo and behold, the mob walks away. Do I think that this is the most accurate portrayal of how this would really happen? Absolutely not. I think that this is one of the arguments that does frame and support the criticism of the white savior. I think that, there's unfortunately, children did not have that much of an impact, and portraying it as such, I think, is a misrepresentation of the system at that time. I also, though, want to add that there is something really important that's said during the scene by Atticus. He mentions that, and it's so simple, but he mentions that mobs are made up of people. So to me, that stands out because each one of these people is biased of their own opinions, biased of their own situations, easily influenced, and each of that person is acting of their own volition, but also they have their own independent spirit. People gathered in that context because it was a socially acceptable thing to do. The mob mentality, as we all know, can be very, very influential. It can cause people to do things that are outside of their nature. And so sometimes there is that reality check that needs to happen that can bring people in. Do I think that that would have come from the white child outside the jailhouse, the daughter of the white lawyer? Not necessarily. But I think that that scene does, and that quote do demonstrate that aspect. Oh, can you guys see me? So now moving into the white savior narrative. As I said, I've already touched on this a little bit throughout. It's one of the most commonly brought up issues with this story. And I think it's important to have a whole section to discuss this. So specifically, is Atticus a white savior? Are the children white saviors? Does the book promote the white saviors? I think, as I said, in some ways, yes. I think in some ways, no. In the movie, definitely. The story, it's the Atticus show. I mean, I love Gregory Peck, don't we all? But that is definitely how the movie portrays it. I also want to point out, people are not saved in this story. It is a very tragic story about how the criminal justice system is unfair and harmful to people of color. And throughout the story, that is illustrated. Even to children that have only grown up in this racial caste system, they begin to see it. I actually put a poll on my Instagram asking people to say on one of those little survey bars if they think that this story promotes the white savior complex. And unfortunately, it landed right in the middle. Some people felt very strongly yes, some people felt no, some people were kind of in between, they weren't sure. Some people said it's been a while since I've read it, but this is my perspective. Some people brought up that the Black characters were used to frame the stories of the white children, and it's about the white children's learning versus Atticus. I can understand that. I don't disagree with that. I do think there's an unrealistic portrayal of the power that the white children have, promoting the white savior complex. I do think, as I said, it's important to point out that nobody is saved in the story. It's a very tragic ending, and The only people at the story that I think really learned anything were Scout and Jem. They're the only people that carried that new knowledge. They challenge it in other conversations. They bring it up when discussing Hitler, for example. Towards the end of the story, Scout asks her teacher, Scout asks Jem, why people are so mortified and disgusted by what Hitler's doing when this type of discrimination is happening in their own community. And people were not open to that conversation. People felt actually very upset by that question in itself because it brings out such strong challenges. I think that, Scout and Jem's character exists to highlight the flaws in what could be considered the perfect Southern society. The church-going people, the segregated class. This society lived up to all the standards, but there were so many things wrong with it. And from the child's perspective, it demonstrated that quite well. Is this the best book to use in schools? Probably not. The language is harmful. It was harmful then, it's harmful now. I would even argue that now we know better and should not be using or encouraging students to engage with literature so openly when we're not entirely ready to accept the consequences of that. And especially if teachers are not properly trained to handle these types of discussions. But I also think that it is a very timeless and timely story because these criminal justice issues still exist. They still bleed into society today. I mean, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Think about even the abductions by ICE today. There is a consistent pattern in history of people of color, specifically African Americans, not receiving any type of equity, fair trial, fair responsibility in the criminal justice system. This happened back with the Scottsboro Boys. This happened with Emmett Till. This happened with Rodney King. This happened with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor. This is still happening today. And we really, really have to have a critical lens when we're engaging with this material to say if it's right or wrong. I don't think any book should be banned. I don't think any book should be wiped off the earth and not allowed to read. But I do think we need to make sure that when we're engaging with books that have harmful language and harmful themes, we're prepared to have discussions about why it's harmful. We can't just use that statement, oh, it was just the time period it was in, because we're still in that time. It's just that society is becoming more and more aware and more awake. So no, I don't think this book should be banned. Yes, I understand why it was challenged. And yes, I agree with some of it. I think that the white savior narrative exists in stories, and it's okay to challenge that, and it's okay to have discussions about that. But I think it's important to remember that in the story, nobody was saved. Scout and Jem are racist. They were racist. They grew up in this caste system, and the children are able to unpack these stories because of their naivety, not because they're activists, not because they're advocating for people. It's because they don't understand. And Atticus, you could argue, helps frame that as well. But I really, really credit that as well to Calpurnia, despite people maybe disagreeing with that aspect of the story, I think, or that aspect of the commentary. I think that Calpurnia is fundamental in allowing the children to explore this perspective. And I think she's one of the most critical characters in the book, maybe perhaps underwritten, but nonetheless, very, very important. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, for engaging with this episode, for being a part of it. And I hope you like the bouquets. I had fun making them. It's something to keep my hands busy. Sometimes, as you see, I forget what I'm doing. I hope you guys tune in for the next episode for March. We will be reading A Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'm quite excited to read this. I've actually never watched the show or read the book, so it'll be the first time for me as well. So I hope you guys read it, follow along. I will be putting polls out, questions out on my Instagram as usual, so please stay engaged. Let me know your thoughts. Something that I found out recently about this book from one of my friends and someone who follows it on Instagram let me know that this book is actually inspired based on true historical events. So that's a little bit disturbing, but I think it also paints a better picture of the context which this book was written, and also in the time that we're living in today where women's rights are being rolled back. It couldn't be more timely. So Thank you all for joining me for this episode, and I'll catch you on the next one. And keep reading like your freedom depends on it, because it does.